Aulë made the dwarves strong to endure. Therefore they are stone-hard, stubborn, fast in friendship and in enmity. And they suffer toil and hunger and hurt of body more heartily than all other speaking peoples. And they live long, far beyond the span of men, yet not forever. Hey everyone, Yoiston here, and I hope you all are doing well, wherever you are in Middle-earth. Today I want to explore Tolkien's Dwarven Archetypes, and how he wrote his dwarves in Middle-earth in a general sense. We won't really be talking lore here, but more how Tolkien made these characters within his stories, as well as some of the tropes that he used for these characters, a mold that has been hard to get around with these characters in a lot of fantasy writing sense. My friends, thank you all for joining me today. Let's begin our tale. The Kindred of the Dwarves, in Tolkien's Legendarium, is one of the most classic fantasy races in all of fantasy literature. Tolkien revives old Scandinavian and Norse tales in his own works, even bringing over names from works such as the Voluspa for the dwarves in The Hobbit. But his dwarves were different from others as well. Rather than being sneaky and perhaps even treacherous as they are in other mythologies and works, Tolkien's dwarves are not generally known for their stealth, and they were typically honorable and loyal by nature, with at least one exception being the Petty-dwarves. Dwarves in other lore or works of fiction, even old cinema, are less warlike and more mercantile, holding wealth and crafting abilities to work with such wealth and create wondrous things that usually drive other characters towards some sort of end or goal. Tolkien takes and changes that in many ways. Other than men, by the time of The Lord of the Rings in the late Third Age, dwarves were most common to find traveling the roads of Middle-earth in trade. So they still engage with some of these archetypes, but many more dwarves, likely even including many of these craftsmen and traders themselves who went abroad, had also skill as warriors and were strong in their form. In the Legendarium, Tolkien crafted this new mold for dwarves in fiction as being hardy in body, honorable, strong of will and mind, warriors, sages, and craftspeople alike, but more pragmatic than arcane or magic, except in their crafts, which might appear to be magical to some. They were spiritual in many ways as well, carrying on ancient traditions and upholding their praise of Mahal or Aulë, their Vala father who created them. They also maintained honor in keeping and practicing their secret language, Khazad-dum, attempting to give as little of that language to others as possible, again seeing it in this honorable and religious sort of way. So what are their weaknesses? Again, another staple in the archetype for the dwarven people as Tolkien made them is their greed, stubbornness, and their ability to hold ancient grudges. In many ways, their own strength works against itself, just as dwarves' nature might do the same. For all their strength, their arrogance and stubbornness matched it. For their abilities to craft and appraise mighty and wondrous objects and treasures, they find that their greed matches those abilities as well. This inner complexity adds a great deal to the internal workings of dwarven characters in Tolkien's works, and may also attract other external threats and world-building opportunities as well. It's very possible that the Ring of Durin, even though it did not turn any dwarf into a servant of Sauron in the way that Sauron had wanted, heightened the greed of the dwarves who wielded it throughout the centuries, so much so that the dwarves might have even become destined to find the Balrog and to be overwhelmed by Durin's bane, losing their home because of it, and perhaps the same might be said of Smaug, that he had learned of this vast dwarven horde and so he came to take it. Perhaps the greed initiated by the ring as it took these qualities of the dwarves and upscaled them, allowed for the Balrog and Smaug to enter the story of the dwarves. With that all in mind, we go to the next large dwarven archetype that seems nearly always present in most dwarves in Tolkien's works. Dwarves are usually always looking to reclaim something, some ancient home or treasure, maybe both. They or their kin have been wronged in the past, and they, even years later, still feel it deeply. For the Petty-dwarves, it was the loss of Nargothrond and their other ancient homes to the elves. For Thorin, it was Erebor and his father and grandfather. For Balin, it was Moria. For Thorin, Thrain even, it was Moria. Every dwarf, even Gimli, felt the loss of Moria, though, especially, even over 1,000 years after it had been taken by Durin's bane. Sometimes dwarves were driven also by a desire to claim vengeance, like the dwarves upon Azog, or even to claim an item of sorts, like the Lord of Nogrod wanting the Silmaril of Thingol, or new lands and colonies, Gimli and the Glittering Caves. Yet dwarves usually find in their story arcs that something else was actually more important all along. For Mim, it was family and kin. For Thorin, it was food and cheer and song above hoarded gold. For Balin, it was accepting what was and enjoying Erebor rather than wanting Moria back as well. For Gimli, it was friendship with other peoples, especially the elves. For Dain, it was accepting the leadership and defense of his people over aught else. In seeking to reclaim or take, dwarves learned these new things, but also, and I might even say usually, such lessons are not enough to save their lives. Mim learned a new sort of compassion towards Turin, but still followed through. Thorin learned the error of his ways, but was too wounded. Balin perhaps learned that he was too ambitious in returning to Moria, and Dain learned to seek not more than Erebor, for he had himself seen Durin's bane within Moria. Yet with these instances, again, they all come to rather tragic and violent ends, even after learning their lesson. The first being murdered by Hurin, the second succumbing to his wounds from the Battle of Five Armies, the third being slain by an orc archer, and the fourth being slain defending a leader of men and his friend Brand. What's more, most dwarves that Tolkien puts emphasis on are rather older and experienced, usually not young striplings in most cases. And so their deaths perhaps are a natural way to end their stories, but again, they never die of old age, these characters. They always die in some sort of conflict. During The Lord of the Rings, Gimli even, who seems younger than other leading dwarves in Tolkien's stories, was still 139 years old, so about middle-aged for as far as dwarves are concerned. Again, Gimli is actually more at the outskirt of many of these archetypes that Tolkien wrote into his dwarves, ironically, because Gimli's his most famous dwarf. But he still carries some of these archetypes in his own ways. So, to summarize, Tolkien's dwarves were strong, loyal, mercantile, and incredible craftsmen who lived in underground cities all across the world, but represented many of the same traditional and religious characteristics, as well as the others listed before, but their weaknesses are to greed and stubbornness mostly. They generally seek reclamation of their homelands, or to claim something else, perhaps something new, but they learn a greater lesson along the way, yet they still usually come to violent ends regardless, being aged and battle-worn already. So, with all of that said, the final piece of this is that dwarves are actually used quite sparingly, I think, throughout the stories of Tolkien's world. We know little about 4 of the 7 dwarven clans scattered across eastern and southern Middle-earth, even though we know a great deal about all of the houses of men and elves. Even though there are many dwarves wandering, trading, and crafting across Middle-earth and beneath the ground in many areas, we actually don't get a lot of them in the stories. The fact that we don't explore too many other dwarven kingdoms, cultures, and traditions solidifies what we know about dwarves as being holistic about all 7 clans, rather than being singular and exclusive to just the Longbeards. For instance, maybe one of the other clans actually rejected Aulë as their idol, or were incredibly sneaky and dishonest. Who knows? But since we can't tell, it's safer, I imagine, to think of them more like Longbeards than not. But still, I think this is made for dwarves to be regarded as generally the same across many different types of fantasy as that same sort of archetype, being established in The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, with some deviations here and there in other works of fiction. But again, it created such a mold. I would say that if we had gotten more about the different clans of the dwarves, perhaps we would come to understand that some dwarves didn't live underground, or that some had allied themselves with Sauron in the end, so on and so forth. Perhaps it would have given us a more diverse view of dwarves, but as it stands, this archetype is again widely accepted by most fantasy authors as the typical archetype of dwarven characters and cultures. And so, my friends, there we have it. I imagine there is much more to explore here, but this is where I'm going to leave it in this video. The dwarves are such a fascinating people in Middle-earth, and I think how Tolkien created them and their archetypes has left a huge legacy in the fantasy genre, making them such a beloved race in so many different worlds. And so, my friends, we come to the end of our tale on Tolkien's dwarven archetypes. From this tale, we see that, for our strengths, we must also work against the weaknesses that come to mirror them, just as the dwarves themselves had to. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you all enjoyed this tale. If you did, please be sure to hit that like button and share this with a friend. What are your thoughts on Tolkien's dwarven archetypes? Let me know in the comments below. If you'd like to support the channel, please consider getting some candles from our friends Mythologie Candles, or order some Weta or United Cutlery Lord of the Rings sword statues and other replicas from Castle Kon, who does international shipping, and use the code WEST at checkout, and please check out our merch and Patreon. Thanks to our Valor Tier patrons and YouTube members: Peter Shepard, John Hume, Maz Gibbs, Reese Jenkins, Arthur Merlin, Theodore, Moon Viper, Andrew Carlisle, and Zumi. Thank you so much to all of our patrons and YouTube members. Please subscribe and hit that bell button to join the Men of the West and all of the Free Peoples today. And I'll see you all again next week with a video on why Middle-earth's technology did not advance. My friends, thank you all so much for joining me on this adventure. Until the next one.